Hola a todos, yo soy Edu. En esta entrevista, Pompliano conversa con Hines, director ejecutivo del Consejo de Criptomonedas de la Casa Blanca, sobre la innovadora Reserva Estratégica de Bitcoin de Estados Unidos y la visión del presidente Trump para convertir a Estados Unidos en la capital mundial de las criptomonedas. Hoy desglosamos uno de los desarrollos más emocionantes en las finanzas globales: la decisión de Estados Unidos de mantener Bitcoin como un activo estratégico. Vamos a explorar los momentos clave de la entrevista de Pompliano con Hines. Quédate hasta el final y descubre qué significa esto para Estados Unidos, México y el mundo. Antes de continuar, te invito a que te suscribas a este canal, dale like y activa la campanita de notificaciones para que no te pierdas ninguna noticia del mundo de las criptomonedas. Gracias por tu apoyo y disfruta del video. La Reserva Estratégica de Bitcoin de Estados Unidos ha captado la atención mundial. Hines explica cómo se gestó esta iniciativa bajo el liderazgo del presidente Trump.
You know, he made it very clear on day 3 with an executive order that he was going to be the crypto president. And, that executive order basically outlined several different things. It created the interagency working group, in which I'm the executive director of. And then obviously we have our brilliant AI and crypto czar, David Sachs, who many folks are familiar with in the financial world, obviously with his VC success and everything else he's done in the business community. But this executive order created this working group. It also established some timelines that we had to hit. The first timeline was the 30-day landmark, which required these agencies to basically do an internal audit or review of everything they were touching inside the digital asset space, really looking over those rules and regulations that, oftentimes had been misguided, specifically under the Biden regime. So, we looked at those rules and regs, then we hit the 60-day landmark, which compelled the same interagency actors to provide a list of recommendations, things that they thought that they could do independently in order to deliver on the president's promise to make the United States the crypto capital of the world. And so now we have this 180-day landmark.
La reserva marca un cambio monumental en Estados Unidos. No solo está reteniendo Bitcoin, sino que está comprometido a adquirir la mayor cantidad posible de forma neutral para el presupuesto, sin costo para los contribuyentes.
And look, we wanted to recognize Bitcoin for being unique because it is. It's a commodity, not a security. It has intrinsic stored value. It has the immaculate conception, as David likes to say. And, the way that we set this up, we recognized it for what it is, which is being unique. And then we also had the digital assets national stockpile because really we wanted to encourage the innovation that's happening across other ecosystems in the space as well. But we wanted to harness Bitcoin for the American people. We view it as being in our long-term interest to hold on to this asset. We obviously have made it very clear that we want to acquire as much as we can get. I've said that repeatedly throughout my time on the speaking circuit over the course of the last few months. And look, at the end of the day, it stipulates that we have to acquire Bitcoin in budget neutral ways that don't cost the taxpayer a dime. With that being said, I think that we have, as the president likes to say, many high IQ people working on these solutions, and we're going to have countless ideas on how we can accomplish this. And look, we have Secretary Letnick at Commerce, we have Secretary Bessent at the Treasury, many other great actors inside the interagency working group, and we'll come together and flesh out some of these ideas and really get to the best solution. But we're very confident that we can do so, and we'll start doing that in short order.
Now, these ideas of acquiring more Bitcoin, I know that none of them have been decided on, but there are many that I think are somewhat obvious of, hey, you could revalue gold, sell it, move things over to Bitcoin. But I think that people drastically are underestimating maybe net new ideas. And so as you guys have been brainstorming, are there themes to things that you guys are thinking about? And, there's one thing to take American taxpayer dollars that are already somewhere within the US government or on our balance sheet and kind of rearrange, right? Financial advisors all the time, they'll go and they'll rebalance their portfolio. That's kind of one whole theme. But then I've also seen Letnick and others talk about this idea of, well, maybe there's external revenue that we can drive and be able to use that. And so how are you guys maybe from a framework standpoint thinking about, okay, what are the ways that we could go buy more Bitcoin?
Well, I think that Senator Lummis has really an interesting idea with the Bitcoin Act of 2025, which I know has taken the community by storm. But here, what you would do is you'd revalue the gold certificates that we currently have at Treasury. Most of which are valued, I think, around like $43 an ounce, which is,
a lot lower than what it's really worth.
Correct. Yeah. So now we're sitting at what, $3,100 an ounce, with being the price of gold. And if you took that value, what you could do is use that extra funding in order to buy more Bitcoin that could be used for the reserve. But that's just one idea. And that's currently circulating its way through Capitol Hill, and we'll see how many co-sponsors she can get and how she can pull her colleagues on board. But we're looking at many creative ways, whether it be from tariffs, whether it be from something else. I mean, there's literally countless ways in which you can do this. And I'll defer to some of our members inside of the interagency working group to see what ideas they come up with inside of their own shops. But we'll look at everything. Everything's on the table, and like we've said, we want as much as we can get. So we're going to make sure that no stone is unturned as we start fleshing out some of these processes.
Do you have a personal goal for the number of Bitcoin that the United States could have? I've heard 1 million thrown out there as a nice big round number.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of different senators and other folks on the Hill talk about specific numbers, but I'd like it to be infinite. I want as much as we can possibly accumulate. And the reality is, I've told many people this, and especially journalists, is they say, well, is there an exact number? Well, no, not really, because that's like saying how much gold do you want as a country? Anything else with intrinsic stored value, you want as much as you can possibly accumulate, and that's no different with Bitcoin.
Más allá de Bitcoin, la administración está impulsando claridad regulatoria para desatar la innovación. La legislación sobre stablecoins es una prioridad clave. Las stablecoins podrían revolucionar los sistemas de pago, haciendo las transacciones más rápidas y transparentes. Hines ve esto como una victoria tanto para los consumidores como para el dominio global del dólar.
Let's talk about stablecoins. That seems to be one of the big focuses right now for politicians across both sides of the aisle. I think there's some agreement, and then there's also a lot of disagreement as to what that framework's going to look like. The U.S. dollar is a very important part of the U.S. economy and kind of our success on that global stage. But there's new technology, and a lot of the success of the U.S. dollar on these blockchain rails are coming from the private sector rather than the public sector. And so how are you guys maybe approaching stablecoins, that legislation, and getting some regulatory clarity there so that the private sector actually knows what they can and cannot do?
Well, at the beginning of that question, you mentioned the speed in which we're operating, and I'd say that's a testament to the president's leadership, along with our AI and crypto czar, David Sachs. I mean, look, I think we're testing the hypothesis for the first time about what happens when you take private sector actors, their leaders in their particular fields, and inject them into government, right? What happens is you start creating much more efficient systems. And that's truly a testament to President Trump and the folks that he's brought into this administration. I think that should be, something that stands going forward as we start thinking about how do we operate this country in a way that benefits the American people more generally. And in regard to stablecoin legislation, we understand how important this is just for U.S. dollar global dominance. We understand how important it is for, altering the ways in which our system works and achieving new payment rails that are more efficient and can allow for the expeditious transfer of asset classes. And this gets us into a broader conversation about what can be done more generally down the road as you start talking about tokenization of public securities and things of that matter.
Hines está trabajando para cerrar la brecha educativa, fomentando la colaboración de la industria y sugiriendo talleres para ayudar a los legisladores a entender las criptomonedas.
In a market, they have criticisms as well. And so how do you think about, maybe where there's areas of opportunity for crypto, but really the critics are pointing out where those areas are?
Well, I'd say that most of the naysayers I certainly don't agree with. In terms of the technological advances that can be made in the global financial system with the adoption of the technology that's emerging out of the space, it's hard to make an argument against that. It's hard to make an argument that our current payment rails and our institutional banking system is a little bit archaic in the way that it operates. But, more generally, I think that as you usher in these technological changes, you'll start to see a lot of minds change very quickly when they start to see the real impact of how it affects them in their everyday lives as they interact with their own finances. And so, for us, I'd be hard-pressed to believe you're going to have the same naysayers out there once this clear regulatory framework is established. And, I think that one of the biggest problems is that there's just an educational gap. There's a lot of folks that haven't interacted with crypto before. In government, there's a rule, an ethics rule that prevents actors inside of certain agencies from actually being able to tangibly interact with digital assets on a day-to-day basis, even on a small scale. So that creates an educational hurdle for us more generally in a sense of just helping people understand what this is, how it feels, right? Your biggest advocates for digital assets are people that own them because they have experience interacting with different asset classes and the technology itself. And so, I think that as you start to see more people interact with the industry, there will be broader adoption in very short order because the technology is there and it'll usher in the change that's needed.
You bring up a really interesting point. I've seen proposals where, hey, maybe politicians shouldn't be able to legislate over certain industries unless they've got experience or they have certain people that advise them, or maybe they have to take a test, right? Do they understand some basic components of it? Using the technology, though, is a whole different game. And it'd be almost like trying to talk about, I don't know, maybe ChatGPT, but never having asked it a question or something, right? And so do you think that there is some pathway there where within the ethics rules, you could have, a tutorial day or something where you just say, hey, look, just sit down and you're going to send, $5 from one wallet to another. Now try to do that with your bank and see how faster that is, right?
No,
are there things like that could happen?
I definitely think so. And look, these are all things that we'll end up talking to our interagency working group about how do we make these rule changes that honestly aren't even so drastic that they should, cause people to be appalled. This is something more or less, how do you allow people to interact with new technology so that they can actually understand it? And that would help us, a lot on Capitol Hill as we're educating members as well. But thankfully we have fantastic leadership there with the folks that truly get it. And, I'd again be remiss not to even thank Chairman Brian Stile, who's the subcommittee chair of digital assets in the House. He's done a phenomenal job. You have Senator Lummis, who's, a Bitcoin champion, and we absolutely love her.
The laser eyes on
That's
X.
right. That's right. And then Senator Haggerty's doing a great job in the Senate. So they're really assisting in terms of educating the members. But yeah, there's certainly things you can do, whether it be workshops, whether it be, changing some rules just to allow people to interact with technology on a small scale. I think we can definitely accomplish that.
¿Por qué Bitcoin? Hines lo compara con el oro, calificándolo como un activo único con valor intrínseco. Hines ve a Bitcoin como el oro digital, con Estados Unidos construyendo un Fort Knox digital para protegerlo. Esta reserva no solo se trata de conservar Bitcoin, sino de asegurar el futuro financiero de Estados Unidos.
The person that's going to benefit the most just from institutional adoption of these technologies, the person benefits the most from Bitcoin being unique and acting as a store of value, similar to gold, is the everyday person, right? And now, granted, we're harnessing in Bitcoins, in the particular instance of Bitcoin, we're harnessing this asset for the American people as well by creating the strategic Bitcoin reserve. But having these outlets to store their assets, and having these outlets to engage in, and being able to touch things that are real and move things to one another in a completely different way benefits them in a tremendous way. So
the stat that I always point out to people, I think it was in 2016, the median U.S. home was like $280,000. Today it's over 400,000. And if you go and you look at Bitcoin, it was like 664 Bitcoin. Now it's 6. And so one, almost doubled. The other went down 90+%. And it really just shows you the power of being able to store your wealth in something that is not going to be debased away.
For sure.
And I think that as I've talked with folks, like that is understood. And it's a simple concept, but it takes kind of a while for people to wrap their head around.
Yeah.
Speaking of information, one of the things that has surprised me the most, I enjoy talking to a lot of the Wall Street or the hedge funds organizations because they have a very different perspective. And I always say that, take Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the most risky asset that they have in their portfolio. In the crypto world, Bitcoin is the safest asset that they have in their portfolio, right? But when I've talked with a number of hedge fund CIOs lately, and these are big multi-billion-dollar funds, I always ask a question. I say, when you walk into your office every morning, what do you check first? Like, what are the data points? And I now increasingly hear some version of, I walk in and I check global liquidity, and then I check the Bitcoin price. And at first I was like, do you guys own a lot of Bitcoin, right? What are you doing? And they said, no, it is a very sensitive asset to global liquidity and interest rates and geopolitical risk and all these different things. And so it's an information tool. Are you all evaluating policies or looking at kind of what's happening on a day-to-day basis based on price, but not as in like, hey, is it going up or down, but more as an information tool? Like, do you pay attention to what's happening in the market as you guys are kind of doing this work that you've been mandated by the president?
We try not to pay attention to price too much because we believe in the premises that we've laid out. And, I can point to the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Executive Order in a sense of how we classified Bitcoin as being unique in its own right, but it certainly gives off information that we can absorb and use to make decisions. But in terms of affecting policy, I feel like we're very well grounded in the sense of how we build our foundation of how we view these things. And I think it's very tempting. I've actually heard from some different actors up here in the industry say, Bitcoin's just running with the market. Well, at first, because naturally, because it's so easy to get in and out of the asset class. when margin calls are happening, people tend to go to crypto because they're able to liquidate very quickly. I think that in a longer, more protracted instance, you'd actually see something completely different where people would actually start storing, value in Bitcoin and protecting their asset classes there. So I think you would see a divergence over time. That being said, I think it could be the same in a bull run economy where, people are saying, I'm going to take the excess and throw it into Bitcoin. And you could see a divergence from market sentiment there as well. So I think that, we understand, just given its uniqueness and how it's been set up, that it is different than other markets. And I think that it gives off a lot of information that way, the same way that gold would over time.
¿Qué significa esto para ti? Hines destaca que Bitcoin y la blockchain pueden hacer que los sistemas financieros sean más eficientes, transparentes y accesibles para todos. Estados Unidos no está solo en esta carrera. Otras naciones están observando de cerca. Y Hines cree que esta iniciativa inspirará una adopción global.
Right now, we currently have the blinders on, right? Because we're attempting to just do what we need to do to deliver on the president's promise, which is obviously to make the United States the crypto capital of the globe and to welcome in this innovation, digital assets industry. And so, we owe it to the American people to deliver to them first. And I'm sure that other countries will be chasing us as we continue to push forward and do that and welcome in this technological innovation. But, I'm just extremely, extremely pleased that we have a president that truly is the crypto president that's welcoming in these changes. And I think you'll see other world leaders follow suit very quickly.
My free idea for you, which you kind of get what you pay for, is you should put a national scoreboard for every country how much Bitcoin they own in the Oval Office, and I think we'll have a lot more Bitcoin at the end of the term if he stands and just looks at it all day long. But I do think that there is some competitive nature, but also collaboration, right? We know that countries like El Salvador and others have been buying or holding Bitcoin, and it feels like the United States stepping in is kind of a breakthrough moment. But do you think that there is some sort of race to see, hey, who has the most? Are there geopolitical, strategic reasons why we want to have the most, or anything that you guys have talked about on that front?
Well, I mean, with any asset of value, there's certainly going to be a race to see who can accumulate the most. And I think that we certainly understand that.
Con un equipo de innovadores como David Sachs y el apoyo bipartidista en el Capitolio, Hines confía en que Estados Unidos iniciará una era dorada para los activos digitales. La Reserva Estratégica de Bitcoin de Estados Unidos es más que una política. Es una visión para un Estados Unidos más fuerte e innovador. Dime qué opinas de la Reserva Estratégica de Bitcoin. ¿Crees que en México se logre en el corto plazo esta adopción? ¿O se quedará rezagado con respecto a otros países? Compárteme tus pensamientos en los comentarios. Si te gustó este video, dale like y comparte. Gracias, Rogers. Nos vemos en el próximo episodio.